The century of no man's land continues.
On April the 22nd, 1975, when Craig Johnstone and Lionel Rosenblatt landed in Saigon, they were determined to help the South Vietnamese, whose lives were in danger, leave the country while they could. With the North Vietnamese army poised to attack, they found the mood in Saigon was not what they expected.
The impression that one got there was sort of surreal. There was tension in the streets, but even there, people didn't know for sure what was going to happen, and some people dismissing the fact that there was even a realistic threat. A very bizarre situation.
The capital had been cordoned off to keep out the refugees fleeing from the north. The South Vietnamese government and the U.S. Ambassador Graham Martin were determined to keep the chaos from spilling into Saigon.
You wouldn't know that anything difficult was about to face this city. So in that sense, Graham Martin had done his job superbly, and the Vietnamese were just in blissful ignorance. And so we knew we were much more apprehensive than the people we were running into.
For many South Vietnamese, it was hard to believe that the United States, after spending $150 billion and losing 58,000 American lives, was just going to look the other way. Ambassador Bui Diem, just returning from Washington, was one of the few South Vietnamese in a position to understand.
At this time, there are still a lot of hopes in Saigon about the American. But my message to all of them was crystal clear. For the American, the war ended already.
The issue is with everybody was, why are we rushing so fast? I'd like some time to get organized, get hold of my assets, say goodbye to my parents, et cetera, et cetera. And we would look at our watches and say, you don't have that much time.
And essentially, if you knew someone and you were at risk, you probably had a chance of getting out. If you didn't, if you were not privy to what was taking place, and it happened very quickly, then you got left behind.
When Rosenblatt and Johnstone stopped by the embassy, they heard that the State Department was furious at their unauthorized mission and had actually issued warrants for their arrest.
So we spent about 10 seconds in the embassy and sped off, but that was very useful because we got the names and numbers then of people at the airport who were forming the beginning of this evacuation network.
Out at Ton Son Nhut Airport, the military did get the ambassador's approval to begin a low-profile evacuation, in contrast to the inaction at the embassy itself. Non-essential personnel, dependents, and select Vietnamese were being airlifted out under the command of General Homer Smith.
I passed the word out that we would evacuate all of our people, Vietnamese or Americans, who wanted to go, and their families. We would bring people into our compound and house them overnight, and then build them into movable packets and ship them out.
We spent those last couple of weeks working almost full time, day and night, pumping people out as fast as we could by every rouge and subterfuge that you can imagine. So in my case, I borrowed a freezer truck from a friend who was running his own black operations. It had an embassy license plate on it, and I used that truck to take out a number of my intelligence officer friends and their families, just stuffed them in the truck, locked them in there, and sneaked them onto the air base, and stuck them on an airplane and got them out.
At that time, I could not find anybody to help me to flee the country.
Nan, the former soldier, was rushing around Saigon on a scooter with his wife and one-year-old son on the back.
And everybody asked each other, do you have any way to leave the country? Do you have any connection with the American or even the Filipinos or who worked in there before, and they can bring you out? Can you help me? Something like that. A lot of worry question.
We didn't begin to touch the total number of people at risk. So some got out, some didn't get out. It was very, very ad hoc.
Between them, Johnstone and Rosenblatt think they got around 500 people out before they too departed. That week, South Vietnam's President Thieu resigned in a tearful speech blaming the United States for abandoning South Vietnam. Thieu's vice president, Tran Van Huong, was inaugurated, only to be replaced within days by yet another politician, Zong Van Min.
There was this strange political intrigue, meaning nothing. This sort of play that they were putting on, no connection at all to the reality of what was happening to them.
In a cable to the White House, Ambassador Martin continued to express confidence in the government of South Vietnam, while President Ford made his position very clear in a speech at Tulane University.
Today, America can regain the sense of pride that existed before Vietnam. But it cannot be achieved by refighting a war that is finished as far as America is concerned.
On the morning of April the 29th, 1975, the North Vietnamese final offensive began with a rocket attack on Saigon's Ton Son Nhut Air Base.
About 3 o'clock, morning of the 29th, my wife and I were blown out of bed.
2 American Marines were killed, the last Americans to die in Vietnam.
Columns of smoke towering up from the air base and the sound of the explosions. The population was extremely agitated.
The streets were jammed with panic-stricken Vietnamese already. It was about 5:30 in the morning. Everyone was heading for the embassy walls.
The embassy plan was for the embassy employees to be taken in, I believe, 6 pre-positioned buses that were in the embassy grounds out to the air base to fly out.
The plan had to change. The North Vietnamese rockets had damaged the runways. The backup plan called for helicopters.
I said, Mr. Ambassador, we've got 140,000 North Vietnamese forces within 20 minutes of downtown Saigon, and he wouldn't believe it. Nor would he believe that the airstrikes had destroyed the runways at Ton Son Nhut, as our American military attaché out there said they had. He insisted on going out and seeing for himself.
And I had one of the officers brief him on the situation. He said, well, he was going to go back to his office and think about it.
As Ambassador Martin continued to think about calling in the helicopters, the crowds outside the embassy began to get larger. The CIA's own helicopters were already coming and going, taking their own endangered contacts out to the 7th Fleet, sitting off the coast in the South China Sea.
It was mid-morning. Air America choppers were moving from the roof of the embassy to various buildings around Saigon to pick up Vietnamese who couldn't get over the walls. There was an old chopper pilot, O.B. Harnage. He spearheaded that helicopter airlift that morning, the improvisatory one. That famous picture of the Vietnamese climbing up a ladder to a roof and a chopper on the roof and a man leaning down to help them up, that was Harnage. That rooftop was the deputy CIA station chief's house. And some of the most imperiled Vietnamese were those climbing that ladder. Harnage got him out.
By now, 1,000 people had gathered at the embassy, hoping to be evacuated. The ambassador had anticipated only 200. There was a flurry of phone calls between the White House, General Smith, and the embassy, pressuring the ambassador for a decision on the airlift.
I called the ambassador and I said, Mr. Ambassador, there's no way we're going to get out of here on fixed-wing aircraft. He said, are you sure of that? I said, yes, sir. He said, okay. So he called, and that was about 10:30 in the morning, called for the rotary wing evacuation.
Finally, Ambassador Martin had agreed, and the White House and the Pentagon began the massive helicopter operation codenamed Frequent Wind.
We knew the Vietnamese were going to be in Saigon the next morning. So we had to get out whatever we could that day. We had an ambassador who didn't want to leave, so we couldn't fully rely on his judgment of the situation. So, and the Pentagon, quite frankly, had made me the fall guys and made me, I had to authorize every helicopter so that if one got shut down, there was a designated victim.
Although the command was given at 11 a.m., no helicopters appeared for hours.
And then happened one of these classic screw-ups. The Pentagon had not agreed on what time to use Greenwich Mean Time, Asian time, Washington time. And we actually had to get every helicopter back, sit them down again, and say start. So we wasted a couple of hours that way.
The embassy was now an island amidst a sea of humanity. And to get through the gates, you had to find an American on the other side who knew you, and some pushed and shoved to get through those gates.
I saw some people crying, some people sneaking, and some people trying to push some other people. It was a very messy scene.
Inside the embassy, they were frantically shredding documents. Then Ambassador Martin announced that he wanted to burn some files left at his residence, which was several blocks away.
I said, "Oh, Mr. Ambassador, don't do that. We got 4,000 people outside now clamoring at the gates."
Marine Major Jim Keane was in charge of embassy security.
Ready to crack the gate.
We attempted to get the gate open. And then I came back and said, "That's not going to happen." He got out, he was madder than hell, he slammed the door, and he decided to walk. So we had to throw together a detail of Marines to block the crowds and try to, everybody was armed to the teeth. And he walked down to the residence. They used thermite grenades to destroy the files. Martin, almost in a fit of pique, told one of the Marines to set off a thermite grenade on his grand piano. He didn't want anybody using it.
He was just in a state of total collapse. Almost a pathetic figure, as a matter of fact. I had great sympathy for him.
Colonel Harry Summers had come from the air base to assist with the embassy evacuation.
Ambassador Martin's world was coming to an end. I mean, everything that he'd been sent over there to do, everything that he believed in, was turning sour.
Major Keane finally waved in the first helicopters at 3 p.m. Saigon time. The recreation compound next door to the embassy became a holding area for the 2,000 or so now inside the embassy's walls. Small groups were taken into the interior courtyard. A landing zone had been cleared. A tree was cut down so the huge transport helicopters could land safely.
90 on a CH-53, 50 on a CH-46, feeding refugees up through the stairwell in the embassy to the rooftop, marshaling them by the firehouse to get into the helicopters in the parking lot, and really pumping out a lot of people.
In the largest helicopter evacuation on record, Marine helicopters flew over 600 missions that day and night, taking more than 1,000 Americans and nearly 6,000 Vietnamese to the aircraft carriers waiting offshore.
Every time we saw a helicopter taking off, we felt even worse. We felt that we are left behind. How come those people are luckier than us? I stood there with my wife without no hope. I know that. I knew that I could not get into there. So finally I went home and just waited for the destiny, for the fate to come.
The century, no man's land, will continue in a moment. The century, no man's land, continues.
Northeast in Circle Saigon searches broke out on the city limits.
This scene at Newport Bridge on the outskirts of Saigon is the proof, if any proof is needed, that the communist forces are finally closing in on the capital. This is the closest the fighting's ever come to Saigon since the communist offensive in 1968. Harry Brown, ABC News, Saigon.
On the afternoon of the 29th, with the fall of Saigon imminent, the crowds of South Vietnamese outside the gates of the embassy were growing desperate.
There was a terrible emotional drama going on at those gates, and those young Marines were in a very stressful situation. Because those who were clamoring to get in were holding letters, crying out that they worked for Mr. Hunter. I work secretary, Mr. Hunter, please, please let me in. I can't live with the communists. And it was a heart-rending set of circumstances.
Inside the compound, Harrington and others who spoke Vietnamese tried to maintain calm among the 2,000 lucky enough to be there.
I persistently reassured the crowds in Vietnamese that everyone would go, that no one would be left behind. Không ai sẽ bị bỏ lại was the phrase. Nobody will be left behind. As long as we're here, you're safe, and nobody's going to leave us behind, and we are not leaving until the last helicopter. So please, relax, get in line, stay in family groups, and you've got to get rid of your luggage. The helicopters can only take people, not suitcases.
Out at the airport, the airlift had gone quite smoothly. The military took out more than 4,000 people. But here at the embassy, a communications problem was developing.
Periodically, they'd ask from the fleet, how many people are left in the embassy, and throughout that late the 29th and right up through around midnight, there's a terrible problem which becomes a credibility gap where the embassy appears to Washington to be a bottomless pit. The belief in Washington was that Ambassador Martin had lost his objectivity and was trying to evacuate all of Saigon through the conduit of the U.S. Embassy, and the embassy evacuation would go on until halted because Martin was just going to stubbornly stay there and keep putting people out.
Dr. Kissinger and Defense Secretary James Schlesinger discussed ending the airlift.
I said, how many people are there? He said 700. I said, how many does it take to get them out? He said 13 helicopters. So I said, okay, let's use 19 as a safety factor. And the ambassador has to be on the 19th helicopter.
But when Washington was given the number 700, there may have actually been twice that many people waiting. Kissinger really needed yet another 6 helicopters to get everyone out.
Whereas on the ground, we are whittling away at the number so that by 3 in the morning, we're down to 420 refugees. 6 or 8 more helicopters, and it would be a clean sweep.
They didn't know we were down to 6 loads. I mean, nobody knew that except us.
Colonel Summers, along with Harrington and their commanding officer, Colonel John Madison, had no idea that the White House had ordered the airlift to end.
But it was never communicated to us. We were caught somewhat by surprise when I think it was the ambassador's assistant came down, in fact, and lied to us and said that the lift was continuing, stay there on the LZ, that the helicopters would be coming in, and he went up and left. I mean, the only time in 38 years of military service I had ever been lied to in an operational matter.
We just kept loading helicopters till all of a sudden there wasn't any more helicopters. Then, uh-oh, what's going on? At the same time, the helicopter control sent out this tagger, which is the signal to say that the next bird in the zone takes the ambassador out. And that order had come from Washington, D.C.
The ambassador's helicopter had arrived from the aircraft carrier Okinawa.
With that, I dropped and I ran down into the ambassador's office. Martin was still sorting files. I said, the president directs you to leave. And he looked up, and over his glasses and fixed me, and he said, all in good time, young major, and everybody knew what that meant. He just froze me. But at that time, Martin looked up at Wolf Lehman and he said, Wolf, I guess it's time to go.
At that point, Major Jim Keene, who's running the Marine Security Guards, approaches Colonel Madison and tells Colonel Madison, "Sir, it's over. Only Americans from now on." And Colonel Madison says, "The hell, I've got a commitment. We need 6 more birds to get these people out, and we've been promised them." And Major Keene, as I recall it, says something to the effect of, "Sir, not going to happen. It's a presidential order."
Madison said, "I'm going to speak to the ambassador." And I, as we watched the 46 lift off the roof of the ambassador, and I said, "There he goes." I said, "This is no nonsense, Colonel. It's time. There are no more helicopters."
And it dawns on Colonel Madison, Summers, and myself that we've been had. Maybe not by malice, but by circumstances.
When we found out that we'd been lied to and that the evacuation helicopters were not coming, and we're told to surreptitiously make our way from the landing zone into the embassy and to abandon these last loads, it was absolute feeling of shame, a feeling of disgust toward the United States and the whole operation.
I was sitting on the hood of a black sedan with its headlights pointing out into the landing zone. And I sat there with a radio, pretending to talk to helicopters that I knew weren't out there, and saying to those people, "Don't go la, don't worry. Large Tuk Tang Lun, big helicopter, Saptai, about to come."
There was no question that this pile of people in the parking lot were going to get left.
It crossed my mind that maybe I should stay. And then I thought, you know, you'll never get these people out. The Marine Guards are leaving. And with that, I excused myself to the Vietnamese, said, "Mat Daidi, I have to go to the bathroom." Went through over to a little house that was in the embassy compound, through the bushes, spirited, you know, got myself into the embassy and headed for the roof.
Around 5:30 in the morning of April the 30th, the last helicopter touched down.
We got on that helicopter, and the helicopter lifted off the roof. I looked down in the parking lot, and of course there were the people lined up in their groups of 50. And they were, of course, I knew, the last victims, the victims of the final betrayal of the war. And the helicopter banked and headed out of Saigon, and we went to the Okinawa.
The century, no man's land, continues.
On the morning of April the 30th, North Vietnamese tanks crashed through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon, and within hours, South Vietnam's President Minh had surrendered.
I received announcement of surrender as a disgrace, and we felt ashamed about that.
As North Vietnamese troops took over Saigon, Nguyen Ngoc Nhan went about destroying evidence of his past in the South Vietnamese army.
We put the gun down to the well, on the uniforms, on the albums from the academy and from the military services. I put everything in the well and we covered. And we started the new life from then on.
Out at sea, America's 7th Fleet was swarming with refugees. As space on the decks became scarce, millions of dollars in equipment was simply thrown overboard. Helicopters were ditched at sea.
And I remember thinking, what an utter, total, useless waste the whole thing turned out to. All of this. I mean, I wasn't thinking about the politics of it or the right and wrong of the policy, but just all those years, all that blood, all that fear, all of it had turned out just to be for nothing, absolutely for nothing.
Official Washington had very little of note to say about the events in Indochina. Senate Democratic leader Mansfield told reporters, the fewer postmortems, the better. It's time to start afresh.
I fully expected when we returned, not just I, but all of us in positions of responsibility returned to Washington, we would be formally debriefed. What were the last days like? What lessons can we learn? This, and this? Nothing. Nothing.
Nobody wanted to learn the lessons of the fall. It was too humiliating. When I came back to CIA headquarters in the aftermath, the attitude was, forget. Go on to the next assignment.
Lionel Rosenblatt and Craig Johnstone were called in for a meeting at the State Department.
When Lionel and I made it back to Washington, we were summoned into Kissinger's office, and we were told beforehand that our lives were in his hands. I mean, it was one of these things where we had already figured long before that we had a better than a 50-50 chance of being fired.
I heard one day that 2 of the Foreign Service officers had just taken off and gone to Vietnam to save people they knew and people that had worked with us, which is a total violation of every State Department rule.
And we walked in, and he said in that typical Kissinger voice, "Is it true what I read about you guys?" And we said, substantially yes.
And I mumbled some disapproval of what they had done. And then I said to them, I'm extremely proud of you. And you did exactly what we as a country should be doing.
And you two guys have been some of the few who've done the right thing, and we're very proud of you and want to congratulate you. And we were astonished, of course.
We spent a lot of time then talking about the issue of Vietnam as a whole. Was there any way to have handled it differently? Once we were in it, could we have extracted ourselves in a smoother way than the way that we did?
In a very real sense, that last drama, that last scene of the last tragic act in the courtyard of the embassy was a microcosm for the war as a whole. Because at the beginning we told the Vietnamese around 1964 to stand up and fight, we're with you. And when we told the Vietnamese that, in our idealism and our naivete and our sense of being omnipotent, we meant it. And in the end, of course, we made that commitment in good faith, but we were unable to carry it out, and we wound up betraying the country. And that's just what happened in a smaller sense in that last hour in the embassy courtyard in Saigon on the 30th of April, 1975.
In the end, America left behind tens of thousands of people who'd relied on the United States to protect them. Most ended up in what the North Vietnamese called re-education camps, Nguyen Ngoc Nhan among them. After his release in 1978, Nhan and his wife and their 4-year-old son fled Vietnam by boat. Their boat sank off the coast of Malaysia. Nan managed to get ashore. His wife and his son died. And that is the Century for this week. We will be back next week on Monday and Thursday and Saturday. We hope you will be as well. I'm Peter Jennings for The Century. Good night.
The Century, brought to you by the new Chevy Silverado. It's not just any truck, it's the truck, and American Century, with over 40 years of investment management experience. To purchase a video cassette or transcript of The Century, phone 1-800-CALL-ABC. You can learn more by reading The Century by Peter Jennings and Todd Brewster, published by Doubleday and sold in bookstores everywhere. Also, look for The Century audiobook edition, available on compact disc and audio cassette. The Century features music from The Prayer Cycle, the new CD by Jonathan Elias.